Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Carpetras, and I'm here today with Peg Pinell. Hi, Peg.
Hi.
Peg is a quilt artist, and we are here just to do an interview to get to know more about you. And you are originally from
Omaha, Nebraska.
Omaha, Nebraska, and you live now in?
Ashland, Nebraska. It's 30 miles outside of Omaha, so it's almost Omaha.
Omaha, born and bred.
Yes.
And you've been quilting for how long?
I started quilting in the 70s at the bicentennial type time when we were all into that. I started quilting then.
But you had a lot of sewing experience prior to that.
I came into it from a garment making background. I sewed all my own clothes by the time I was in junior high. My mom didn't quilt, so I self-taught myself to quilt. Saw an article in a magazine about making a double wedding ring out of the scraps.
Which there were a lot of articles at that time.
Yes, out of scraps, and that wasn't so successful, but as I moved on, I made some others.
Well, tell us more about the scraps.
Oh, well, I used scraps from the clothing I was making, so it was double knit and t-shirt knit and jersey and shirting, and I made the double wedding ring block, and it was not so easy to quilt, and so I decided quilting probably wasn't for me, and I moved back to clothing again.
Okay.
And a little later, they came out with a quilt-as-you-go log cabin, and I made about 11 of those and really got into that. And so that's kind of when I started quilting.
Time?
Yes, I was using cotton, and what was available at that time was 36 inches wide, wrinkly cotton. So, I started with that, and then I moved on from there and started branching out into other quilts. And my first applique quilt was my bicentennial quilt. I feather stitched it and I machine quilted those first quilts.
Oh, that was going to be my question. Did you ever do any hand quilting?
I tried a little bit and I really didn't enjoy it. So machine quilting was the way to go. So my first applique was feather stitched through the batting, through the backing, quilted as you go. And so that's how I started machine quilting. Did they
have walking feet?
No.
At the time?
No.
So
it was all on just a domestic machine set up for garment construction.
Okay.
So.
And I'm sure it's gotten a lot easier.
Oh, it has.
You've moved away from strictly traditional quilts. For instance, this quilt that you've got hanging behind you.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about it.
The one behind me is called Night Faces, and that's a traditional block, but it's skewed. So I took the compass stars and I made them off-centered and then set them into the background. And then the quilting is more important on this one, actually, I think, than the piecing, because that was to showcase the quilting on that dark background. There's still, a lot of my quilting is still based on traditional design, but I've moved into more working from my photography, so I take pictures, and a lot of nature influence is what I do. So a lot of my later quilts are animals and things like that have taken in nature. But I also am doing a series called Beadscapes, because I do a lot of embellishing on my quilts. And so
this example on the table
is
one
the example on the table is one that is heavily embellished. This has got lots of beads on it and other embellishment items, yarns and things. And my newer ones, the series of Beadscapes, they're all beaded quilts, but they're different landscapes, waterscapes, different things like that. So they're called Beadscapes.
Okay. And what's this one called?
This one is called Beautiful Butterfly.
And is this based on a photo that you took?
This one is not. This was a challenge quilt. I'm really big into challenge quilts, and I promote them when I go around guilds. And so we just had to do something with a butterfly on it. So I figured if it was going to have a butterfly, it might as well have a big old butterfly on it. So I did use lots of different techniques. The flowers on here are actually silk flowers that I tore apart and flattened and then just quilted down onto the top of the quilt.
Sure, I see that. I can see that. That's ingenious.
And a lot of my quilting follows the designs. I don't do much marking, so a lot of it follows the design of the quilt. I kind of quilt as I go. I don't really decide ahead of time or do a lot of marking on my quilts.
I see, I see. Are there any types of fabrics that you enjoy using more than others? I mean, this is a lot of beautiful batiks here.
A lot of these are batiks. I use a lot of batiks, but I hand dye some of my own fabrics now. And I use non-traditional fabrics as well. I use a lot of silk and linen and things like that. So I like to use so I get different textures and different feels, and some are shining, some aren't, so I like using that.
Let's go back though to, you were you know, your earlier days of quilting, and you said you were making a lot of quilt-as-you-go log cabins.
Right, I started there.
And then where did you move to?
Well, I started teaching machine quilting in the mid-90s, early 90s.
Okay.
And so then I started making a lot of quilts that were class samples. So they were things that I could take into the class, teach as a sample, and they could make a project, and then we would quilt it at the end. Or sometimes they would just quilt. So a lot of the years in the middle were making samples for different classes that I taught. So they were still original designs, but they were based on traditional blocks. And so I had a line of patterns that I did for a while, and did that for quite a long time. And I still do teach traditional techniques and machine quilting and things like that. So I still do those quilts, but for myself, I'm more into making art pieces. So most of the current pieces I'm working on are more art quilts rather than traditional.
We were talking earlier about how many quilts do you have on beds in your home? And your answer was?
I don't have a quilt on any bed at my house. I had one for a while. My husband threw a briefcase on it, made a hole in it. I took it off, fixed the hole, and hung it on the wall. And that was kind of, I started hanging quilts on walls. And then I got a commission to do a piece in a hospital. And so that was my first one that was done, and I sold and hung somewhere. And so that kind of got me interested in doing gallery work and getting my pieces out and shown more. So I have several pieces in private collections. I do commission work and have several in different businesses around town. I do some churches. I have large pieces in some churches too. So.
Okay. And you've shown in a lot of major quilt shows too.
I have. I've had pieces in Houston and Paducah at both those shows, so that's always an honor to get selected for one of those.
Yes. And what categories were they in?
Well, usually wall art, because
Okay.
that's what I make, so that's the categories they've been in.
And you've also been in a couple of magazines, including one that we've heard about.
Right, I had one that three of us made that we had on the cover of Quilter's newsletter a number of years back, and I quilted that quilt.
Well,
So
welcome back.
That was an honor too. So.
We're happy to have you. So let's go back to talking about the type of work you're doing now and where that might be taking you in the future. You said you just had a gallery show.
Yes, I just had a gallery show. My first, it's a dual show, but we each have our own gallery space, so it's like having a solo show. And I belong to 2 or 3 small art quilt groups, and so I've had pieces shown with the group, but this is the first time I've had one shown, just all my own work in one gallery, and it was put on by the Nebraska Arts Council. And it's only the second textile show they've ever put on, so
that's
it's
exciting.
really exciting to have textile art represented as an art rather than as bed covering, which we know is a lot of times what they refer to it as.
Yes, that's a whole, as I like to say, that's a whole other Oprah. That's
Right.
a whole other discussion, which is very interesting, but our time doesn't allow us for that right now. But again, that was a conversation we were having a little bit off camera about the difference between art quilt and bed quilt.
Right.
And you've made a fair number of bed quilts. You
I
just don't
have,
have them in
I
your
have.
home anymore.
Right. Well, I still make quilts for gifts. I make baby
Yes.
quilts, and I
Yes.
make wedding quilts, and I make things like that. And I just enjoy working with the fabric, which is the main goal for me. And I truly believe that quilting, there's room for everybody in the quilting world. And that's what I like best about quilting, is there's a place for those that make really traditional quilts and those of us that like art quilts and everybody in between.
Right.
And so that's my favorite part about quilting, is that there's room for everybody, and we all I appreciate very traditional quilts. I appreciate hand quilting, and I can go to a show and really love what everything looks like, but we all have a place, a niche where we can fit in and do our own thing. So.
And going back to the idea of, for instance, the Nebraska Arts Council, this is only their second textile art show. You're a member of Studio Art Quilt Associates.
I am.
SAQA is the shorthand name for them, and they've really done a lot of great work in promoting textile art as art.
Right.
And getting into spaces. How long have you been involved with SAQA?
This is just my second year. I came in 6 months after I was in. I'm now the Nebraska regional representative. And so I really wanted to get involved because I believe it's something that's really necessary to get people to realize that there are other ways to use quilts besides on your bed, and to realize that fiber itself can be used in so many different ways. So I've gotten pretty involved, and we've got a show currently traveling that will be shown in in galleries as well as larger quilt shows. So it's kind of a crossover between the two, and that's a good thing, I think.
Nice camaraderie there.
Right,
And
right.
Like I said, they do a lot of, well, they promote, they produce wonderful shows, traveling exhibits.
They do.
And have challenges. And going back to that, you said you love challenges.
I love challenges. I'm kind of the challenge queen. I'm always the one that's, I have a piece right now that's in Australia that I've entered this challenge 5 years in a row. And well, this is actually my 6th piece that went down this time, and I've won twice and come in second twice, so it's kind of exciting to be on an international stage as well.
Absolutely. So, what's the challenge? Who does it?
It's put on by a guild down there, and they put it into galleries and show it in a quilt show setting, but as well as some art galleries. And it's sponsored by machine representatives down there. So it's always different. It has a theme, usually a one-word theme. This year's was nautical, and they give you a little piece of challenge fabric, and there's a size restriction. And other than that, there's no restriction. So my pieces have been kind of all over the board as to what they are. And there's some interesting things working with another country. You know, everything comes in centimeters, so you have to be cognizant of that while you're figuring it all out and shipping it down there. You bite your nails the whole time worrying that it's going to get all the way to Australia. But someday I'd like to go down and see all the places my quilts have been.
Absolutely. Put that on the list.
Yes,
yes. And you said you've won a couple of times, and overall, over the course of your career, what's your prize tally at?
Oh, well, I have, in my bio it says over 200 prizes.
Wow.
I've got, in my closet in my studio, they're all pinned up in there because I don't have them out in the other room. But I've, in shows and fairs and other places, I've done my share of winning.
That's fantastic.
But
well, how prolific are you? I mean, how many quilts a year do you make, or how fast do you work, or how many hours a week?
I work every day because this is what I do. So I'm in my studio every day. In fact, my husband thinks I'm up there every day, all day long and night long. If I'm working towards a show, you know, I spend more time in the studio. If I'm, you know, just working on my own, then less time. I usually have one really big piece that takes several years to complete. And while I'm doing that, I finish lots of other pieces. So I probably finish 15 to 20 pieces at least a year in different sizes. Some years more, some years less. So just depends on what deadlines I have. I'm a deadline worker.
Okay.
So.
Well, what sort of deadlines do you see coming up for you in the next few years? I mean, you're branching into showing in galleries and having shows. Is that an avenue you want to keep pursuing?
Yes, I do. I belong to 2 smaller fiber arts groups besides SAQA, and our goal for both those groups is to show our work. So we're working on getting into galleries and showing in different places around the region, not just in Omaha, but around the region.
Yeah.
And so that is a focus of mine right now, is to do more gallery work. I've started selling some of my work. My heart really isn't in that. I can sell, I do commission work, as I said, and when I'm making something from the start that I know isn't mine, it's a lot easier to part with. But when I make something that I never thought about selling, it's a little harder to part with those. So that would be a mindset I'd have to change, I think, if I want to really get into that totally. But I do like people seeing textile art and seeing fiber art out in galleries. So it would be a focus of mine to do that more.
Well, your work is beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
You know, as a mid-career quilt artist, we look forward to checking in with you again a few years down the line and see what's come to pass since this interview. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye. Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.